patriotism, faith, national unity, education, fiscal responsibility, civility, the values that define America. Fascinating stories and talks from America-loving patriots dedicated to preserving freedom, opportunity, and justice. Welcome to the Friends and Fellow Citizens podcast. Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 117 of Friends and Fellow Citizens. I'm your host, Sherman Talosky. Thank you all so much for joining me for this episode, which is a bit about St. Patrick's Day. I was on specifically on St. Patrick's Day, but it's about an Irishman, so I guess that counts. So if you haven't already, as a kind reminder, if you like this episode and like this podcast, make sure to subscribe to Friends and Fellow Citizens. You'll get notifications when episodes come out on your favorite podcast app. You can also subscribe to our email list to get notifications there through your inbox as well. This episode is a bit from the previous interview episode when we spoke about President Lincoln with Dr. Green. You can check out that interview episode after you listen to this one if you haven't caught that one yet, episode 116. And I wanted to combine Lincoln and St. Patrick's Day, and today's topic is about a former U.S. Senator named John Conness. Conness is an Irishman who was born in Ireland in 1821. He came to the United States as an Irish immigrant in 1836 at the age of 15. What is interesting about Conness is that later, as you'll hear, he was a huge advocate for immigrants to the United States, and in particular about a subgroup, and I'll talk a little bit later about that. But I'm curious to wonder if his experience coming to America from Ireland may have affected the way he had political views and just the way he viewed U.S. immigrant policy. And I'm sure that himself, as well as his family and the people he knew, probably had their own experiences. But there's not as much I could find on if Conness had a diary of some kind or some cumulative archive of looking through his papers and seeing what kind of views he had. But we do know that he actually learned how to build pianofortes, which is a fancy term, a longer name for pianos, which from my experience has been pretty rare for people who eventually became a U.S. Senator. My mother actually studied piano accompaniment at the university level for her doctorate, so that connection is really, really interesting and certainly hits home directly to me. And I wonder if he was good at it. I wish there were some audio recordings. Maybe he just liked building them. Maybe he just wasn't as good as playing the piano. But anyhow, he was drawn to the gold rush, and because he was drawn to the gold rush, he was drawn to go into California. And so he, just like many people in 1849, around that time, went to California, and he decided to operate a store in Georgetown, California, which is very close to the Sierra Nevada, and it's actually not too far from present-day Sacramento. Conness was coming from a long way. He grew up in New York when he moved to the United States, so probably a big change in lifestyle, going from the the East Coast onto the Sierra Mountains, which at that time, other than people knowing that there was gold, there wasn't a whole lot of infrastructure there. So you can imagine what that journey was like for someone who really was taking that gamble to go from one end of the country to another to look for more fortunes. Now, as a 49er, he did very well in Georgetown, and he did a lot to sell materials for miners. He was not very much into running for office initially. I'm sure if he were to go back in time and if everything was going super duper well with the whole debate of slavery, he probably would have just kept doing what he was doing, or at least do some more of really the mining industry. I think that was probably a passion that he really had, and he probably would have tried to rise to the top, maybe to own a mining company. But the real issue, as I alluded to, is slavery. And as he was in California, he realized that pro-slavery advocacy was growing in his state. He initially was a Douglas Democrat, or someone who was more aligned with Douglas on his views on at least tackling the issue of slavery. Now, I believe because of his switch from being a Douglas Democrat to later becoming a Union Republican, I would think that Conness probably inside had a lot more stronger views on anti-slavery advocacy and just how much he hated slavery. But perhaps it was because of how difficult the politics were in the 1850s that at the time, at least, Douglas was a very, very strong figure in the Democratic Party. And a lot of Democrats across the nation felt that some version of what he put out as a platform for the Democratic Party would be feasible. Ultimately, obviously, did not become feasible with the Civil War, but nonetheless, Conness really started getting involved in politics as a Douglas Democrat. And these labels are really important too. You're probably wondering, well, gosh, what's the difference between Douglas Democrat and just a regular Democrat? Why did I just call them all Democrats? Well, it's because the fissures and the divisions within the Democratic Party, and to some extent the Republican Party, which later was formed under Fremont and then obviously nominated Lincoln. But the two major parties in the United States were incredibly divided. We forget that it wasn't just a divide between North and South. It was a division within divisions. So the division within the Democratic and the Republican parties just cannot be overstated. Conness not only was rising in politics, but he actually initially took over as an assemblyman after a man named Dave Broderick, a very powerful California politician, lost in a duel in San Francisco. And actually, there's a street in San Francisco named Broderick, which is named after David Broderick. Now, Conness is not the most popular person in there, but he was able to become assemblyman, and later in 1863 is chosen to be the next United States Senator from California. Not only did he make it to office, and this was his first term. Remember, he never served in Congress. This was his first ever term. And he was not only one to be a newbie, but he really got along with none other than Abraham Lincoln. President Lincoln very, very much admired this man, Senator Conness, and they both worked together very, very well. One major piece of legislation that Conness passed, in part because he didn't really introduce a lot of pieces of legislation, not sure exactly why. It could be because he was a freshman and a lot of the senators at the time probably didn't take him very seriously, except some maybe close to Lincoln. One piece of legislation that affects people to this day was a piece of legislation to protect a national park that certainly a lot of Californians, but I think really people from across the nation know and treasure very much. The story goes is that there was a captain named Israel Ward Raymond, and all I know, he's just a captain, so I don't know exactly what he was doing before, but he traveled to Yosemite in 1862. He was amazed by the beauty, the waterfalls. I've been to Yosemite. This was several years ago, but he was just taken aback by the amazing nature. But one issue really startled him. It wasn't slavery. It wasn't anything like that. But it was the privatization of that land by certain settlers. And it was just a complete mess. There was absolutely no organization whatsoever in terms of finding ways to preserve that land and preserve that beauty. Captain Raymond felt like he's seen enough. So he writes a letter to Senator Conness. And in part, he writes, quote, "To prevent occupation, let the wonders of Yosemite be inalienable forever." He even included photo plates from a photographer named Carlton Watkins, and just to illustrate what he thought was so precious on this earth, that he wanted some way for Senator Conness to get involved and to protect this land so that other people can enjoy it without damaging our natural world. Conness receives this letter, And he writes to the Department of the Interior's General Land Office and asks if they can put together some legislation. After probably intense lobbying from Conness and people who were interested in particular, probably the Lincoln administration, this bill ultimately passed both chambers of Congress and was signed into law by President Lincoln. I believe it was passed on June 30th, 1864, and it created something called the Yosemite Grant. So what we know about national parks and the preservation of national parks can really stem from this piece of legislation by Senator Conness and supported by the Lincoln administration. Now, I think Teddy Roosevelt, I think, should get a lot of credit, don't get me wrong, about protecting the environment, protecting national parks, but it's very interesting to see how Senator Conness and a president we all are familiar with, Abraham Lincoln, were actually very early pioneers of legislation to protect national parks. After a brutal civil war, as we all know, President Lincoln was sadly shot in April 1865 at Ford's Theater, which, if you haven't been to DC or haven't been to Ford's Theater, I highly recommend that place. It's a fantastic place to contemplate and reflect on President Lincoln's life. And the story goes that Senator Conness was with two other senators, was Senator Stewart from Nevada and Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts. Yes, he got along with those people. And I think it's just a side note, the fact that he knew Charles Sumner really well, that shows, I think, how much political capital Conness had, because Sumner was known as the man who really pioneered anti-slavery legislation and the anti-slavery movement in Congress. To be able to get that close to him, I think is a true statement of how good a Senator Conness was, even during his one term that he would serve in the Senate. On the night of Lincoln's assassination, they were not in Ford's Theater, but they rushed to the scene where William Seward, the Secretary of State, was shot, and they realized that something was up. Senator Conness knew that things had to move quickly when it came to security. He felt that this was a direct target against the Lincoln cabinet, and he helped order soldiers to protect Edwin Stanton, the Secretary of War under President Lincoln. That story really resonates to me because knowing that Conness took action to initiate security for Lincoln's cabinet, not even knowing probably what the condition was for the president. The president passed away the following morning after the night of the shot. It shows really just how urgent the situation was. And we all obviously know the story, but I think to know some more about what these people did on the night of the Lincoln assassination is really something to think about and something to appreciate in terms of the effort, the collective effort that was made to do everything they could to protect the president and to continue running the country. I mentioned earlier about the close relationship between Lincoln and Conness. That relationship really came out strongly for me when I learned that Senator Conness was a pallbearer for Lincoln. And it was something that I'm sure you can imagine him responding directly to that night, and now to be a pallbearer for the 16th president. I'm sure it was such an emotional time for him and for the people close to him. Just an image that you just can't get out of your head as you think about how history unfolds. As mentioned earlier, Senator Conness was a very, very strong advocate for immigrants and really just to treat them justly. He was already a very fierce anti-slavery advocate. Another issue he saw really brewing in California was anti-Chinese sentiment. And the idea was that people felt that Chinese workers who were very much employed at the time were taking jobs away from white workers. And Conness starts becoming increasingly more vocal about ensuring that Chinese immigrant workers were protected with their certain rights and making sure that they were able to still work and come to the country, because obviously some people on the other side, a lot of people actually, were trying to stop and stem Chinese immigration, which ultimately happened later with the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882. Conness does this at the expense of his political run. Despite all the support that was lost under him when he was started speaking in favor of Chinese immigrants, despite the fact that a lot of people probably made threats against him, who said a lot of bad things about him and his family, he decided that this was what he firmly believed in, and he wasn't going to back away from it. And because of his views, he did not win another term as senator. So he finishes his term on March 4th, 1869, and his seat is taken over by another man named Eugene Casserly. Conness becomes a bit more of a quieter figure. A lot later in his life, he actually decided to relocate to Boston, Massachusetts, which at the time was a huge place for Irish Americans. Certainly, I'm sure throughout his time as someone in California, you certainly couldn't resist showing people probably his Irish heritage in terms of the customs that he was probably used to when he was a lot younger. He decides to relocate back, and he remains there for another 40 years. So he really departs from politics in California. And I will say, though, he's certainly not the last one to leave California because of its politics. That's for sure. But he decides to remain there, and he died in an insane asylum in Jamaica Plain, which is a part of Boston now. He passes away on January 10th, 1909. He was 87 years old, so he certainly had a very long life. And he is now buried in Cedar Grove Cemetery in Dorchester, Boston. I like to take this time to reflect on Senator Conness's life. I think he is, while he is a minor character in any sort of history about the Civil War, he is really a classic example of, I think, of someone who was not only savvy of protecting Yosemite Park but also attracting tourists too, because he also knew the value of that. He not only did those things, did the right task to keep him in political power, but he did so by building relations and doing, I think, the country a great service further down the line, perhaps a lot further than anyone at the time could have imagined. He was certainly not the only advocate for immigrants or even for Chinese immigrants, but he, I think, played a role in at least providing that voice and knowing that he wasn't going to just take a path that was just going to ensure him re-election. He only was serving one term in the Senate, and anyone who knows about the U.S. Senate knows that if you want to really rise up in the ranks, you have to be in the Senate for quite a long time. 2 terms probably at the minimum, but probably nowadays maybe even 3 terms is kind of the minimum, depending on how political savvy you can be. But Conness decides to really set all that aside, and in his honor, Mount Conness in the Sierra Nevada, not too far from Yosemite, is named after him. But it's really fascinating is to know that next time when I go to Yosemite, I would think about John Conness, think about President Lincoln. You would never think you would probably go all the way back to the 1860s, but to know that a piece of legislation that he very much supported and wanted to get passed so we can start protecting these national parks, that has to really feel good about what he did and his contribution to our greater society. Just some takeaways, I think, from the story of Senator Conness. First is, I think we need to have better discourse on environmental protection. It's just almost emblematic of what polarization looks like in the United States, when people are now accusing each other of bad motives, when people might not have bad motives on either side, whether it was one side wants a whole lot more protection maybe from the government, or another side say, well, maybe not so much, we have to also ensure energy and whatnot. There has to be a better conversation, better discourse about the environment. Too often, I think one of the biggest problems I'm seeing is really just the hypocrisy that I'm seeing from some of these people. We've seen in the news of some of these young climate activists, of people throwing soup or whatever the next substance is on a Van Gogh painting, or we see people blocking roads. I've seen some of those scenes in Europe where these people are blocking roads, gluing themselves. How insane do you have to be to do these actions? We are not doing enough as a society to prevent people from doing these things. It's not just a law enforcement element, it's got to be a cultural element. When we start telling people what the avenues of change are, and we tell them that there's more ways and more effective ways to affect policymaking, when we start teaching people about how complex, how bureaucratic Washington, D.C. is, then we might get a bit more realism. But a lot of times when I hear discussions about the environment, it seems very binary, when in fact it might not actually be as binary as people think. I don't think there's that many people in this world who want to destroy Yosemite National Park. I don't think that's really the predominant view when someone from a quote-unquote pro-climate agenda or whatever is trying to get people to be on their side. I don't think that attitude is helpful. So we have to be more honest, I think, with our environmental actions. I'll never forget one time when I was in Union Station. Now, Union Station in Washington, D.C., very close to the Capitol. And I was eating lunch one time and I was looking for the recycling bin. I could not find, at least at the time, this is a few years ago, I could not find a single recycling bin in Union Station in Washington, D.C., just blocks away from a couple of chambers where there's some members who like to accuse people of some kind of climate hypocrisy, or that they claim that others don't care about the environment, when that change wasn't even happening in one of the busiest train stations in the United States. And my point is that I hope that there's people who can realize that a lot of that change has to start coming from people's habits. When we start seeing people, when we start seeing more recycling bins, when we start seeing that people or governments are encouraging some kind of programs to encourage people to not litter or things like that. It can be very simple things, but we have to really emphasize these elements of community-based sort of environmental initiatives, I think, before we get to some level where we can have a national conversation about the environment. Senator Conness, I don't think, would ever be someone who would be gluing himself onto a road in San Francisco. That's not the kind of person he was. And one of the reasons why I think he was respected by Lincoln and some others, probably close to the president, was perhaps the way he conducted himself, as opposed to some other senators at the time, and even nowadays, who don't act anywhere near like the adults they should be. The second point is we should be doing better to not say what we do not know. And I'll use this as a time to read a quote that Lincoln once said of Conness. President Lincoln once said that Conness, quote, is habitually careful not to say what he does not know, unquote. And Lincoln described him another time as, quote, one of our United States senators of high standing, whom I cheerfully endorse, unquote. I love the part of saying, careful not to say what he does not know. Doesn't it seem to you that a lot of times in our society that there's people who are saying things, but they actually have no idea what they're talking about? Have you ever seen those kind of cases of social media? I'm sure you have. I'm sure the answer is yes. But this is an important point. If we start saying that we know this or know that, or if there's breaking news about something and we claim that we know information that everyone else does not know, we start to get down to a very, very dark path of ignorance. We've got to figure ways out to not only prevent people from saying those things and gaining credibility, we have to do better of just admitting that we can't always be the expert on everything. Why do you think Congress has all these committees? The reason why is because Congress is not an expert on anything, or really an expert on a whole lot of things, at least. It's not necessarily a measure of intelligence. It's just the way people are. It's the way that institutions are. No institution can know everything. That's why you have experts. That's why you have other people who can chime in on different opinions. But I don't understand why a lot of times on social media or in the news where you hear some senator saying that, oh, yeah, we need to do this. And I'm thinking to myself, I don't think the senator really knows anything about this area. And no offense, but this is kind of why you need to have people surround you and tell you things that even you yourself might not want to hear. But this is really just a broader conversation about maybe just being honest. I will tell you, I'm not an expert on healthcare policy. I'm not even an expert on environmental policy. But I think we can be curious. We can be curious and ask other people who may know these things better. Hear from different sides of the issue. That certainly is something that can relate to a bit of the previous point about protecting the environment. Number 3 is really important, I think, of preserving and telling the story of immigrants, and especially in local communities. I think of an example of how in northern Nevada we have these communities in like Dayton, Virginia City, which is a beautiful place and a place that really, really will always be in my heart and my family's heart. And Carson City and other places where there's actually quite a bit of history of Chinese immigrants. And it would be an amazing experience where we can replicate, just like across the nation, if we could replicate this idea of being able to bring out some of those stories from back in the past, even if it's a recreation, bring out these stories of immigrant groups from all different walks of life. I think that is the American way of telling a story. We can never tell American history without telling the story of immigrants, because every single person is either descended from an immigrant or has come here as an immigrant. And I think Conness' story really can bring about, or at least animate, a desire to really bring about these stories to all different walks of life, including our state fairs or local schools or colleges and universities or even companies, wherever it is that we can be able to tell those stories, do so in a calm and manner without having to allude to our political differences about immigration policy. But Conness, I think, could be maybe serve as an example of how we can protect the history and be able to preserve that history so future generations can learn more about the time we're living in. I hope generations of the future will preserve that tradition for years and years to come. And with that, thank you all so much for listening to this episode about Senator John Conness of California, a bit of a tribute to St. Patrick's Day, talking about an Irishman senator. Be sure to subscribe to Friends and Fellow Citizens if you enjoyed this episode. Have a great rest of your day and rest of your week. And remember, a day in America is always better when we are with our friends and fellow citizens.